I got this understanding of Starmer that he's this sort of buttoned up, quite old fashioned man, and the emotion is just there. It's just there. It takes nothing for it to come out. It's just immediate. And so that's a key part to him. And then it's the inability to articulate his emotion. And I think that's the connecting thread with his inability to articulate what he wants to do as Prime Minister, what this Labour government is for, what the country feels. Why is it so sort of on the edge? What are the places that made him? Oxford, Leeds, where he went to university, then Oxford, where he I think he did a law masters, and then London, and then he's in Islington for the rest of his time. These are real places. They're not like fraudulent parts of the country, but they're not Birmingham and Yarmouth and Blackpool and these places. So does he know that? Does he understand the country? He's the last one trying to make the old system work.
Tom McTague, welcome to PoliticsJOE. Hello.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Very excited. We're going to talk about this delightful edition of the New Statesman. There we go. Check that out. Your cover story. And I suppose maybe tangentially your editorship of the magazine. But before we get into it, how would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Tom McTague. I'm the new editor-in-chief of the New Statesman, which feels great to say, and that is my very first edition. So it is a kind of launch of my editorship, which is fantastic. But I did feel the pressure, sort of thinking about how to do it, how to just signal what we're trying to do with the magazine in the first issue, and that's what we've tried to do there. We're aiming big. We want to go for the people with power, but not just sort of political power, cultural power. God, I'd love to have Dua Lipa on the front of that magazine.
Yeah.
You imagine it. Slightly more attractive photo, I imagine.
He looks pretty dapper, I think, to be fair to him, Starmer. He is a handsome fella. It has to be said. I'm staring into his eyes now.
I thought George Smiley in the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy remake.
Yeah, it is a bit that. You're right. Okay, that's interesting. Tell me more about that direction then, and how perhaps you view this piece, and we are going to talk about the piece, is perhaps a bit of a departure, or maybe if it's not that, the direction you want to move the magazine under your editorship.
Yeah, so I spent quite a bit of my career at American news magazines, Politico and The Atlantic, and The Atlantic was pretty formative for me in thinking about journalism and how to make it work online. And I think ultimately what The Atlantic got to was an understanding that they should just do what they're really good at in the magazine online. Don't overthink it. You need to get people to buy the content. And the way you buy the content is you produce really good stuff that you can't get elsewhere. People don't need or want this kind of 1,000 words about what happened yesterday. It's kind of like the death valley of journalism. It's covered completely, but that sort of page lead in a newspaper that we all used to read sort of gone. And I think what people want is new thinking. They want new stuff. They want new information that they didn't know. So exclusive scoops of the old variety. They could be 400 words, 200 words, 1,000 words, whatever. And then they want the definitive piece on somebody to get or an idea or a trend. What's happening in the country? How do I understand the country? What's going on with housing? What's going on with power? What's going on with the kind of vibe of the country? So I think like the best magazine journalism has to capture the vibe of a country in a way that people completely get. And that's not just through politics. It's mostly not through politics. It's mostly through the sort of adjacent to politics subjects, stuff that emerges in memes online, and you just go, yeah, that's bloody right. I know that's true. So how do you capture that in journalism? And you guys do it here. So we want to capture some of that sort of spirit. And then that is a kind of an attempt to do that with a politician that we all know, but do we know him? And my attempt is to kind of get under the skin of him and present him in a way that is real and it makes sense of what his sort of failures as a politician and perhaps his kind of strengths.
Yeah, by those terms, I think that the piece certainly fills those criteria, and it's really interesting to hear you talking about but possibly specifically like where a magazine and where magazine journalism sits, because I've interviewed his lot before about it, and he had a line that stuck with me ever since, which was that so much of political journalism specifically is focused on what is going to happen, or being the first to say what will happen, and that could be all the way through from what time a speech is going to be, all the way, when will the tanks roll towards Kyiv,
Yeah.
and obviously that has a place, but not enough people, I think, look back and go, what happened? Why did it happen? And what are the consequences of it happening? And that slightly more reflective, analytical space is something that I think we are poor in our media landscape for not having. So yeah, like I said, Peace, it ticks those boxes. You spent a lot of time shadowing him, Starmer that is, speaking to people close to him to build up this profile. Tell me about the process first before we get into what you learned and what it meant. What was sort of shadowing a prime minister for that period of time? It's not the first time you've done it. You've done it with Boris Johnson as well. What's it like?
It's a hard process, and you kind of feel this pressure building on you because the challenge is to get something new from them. To not like, oh, they're going to announce something and I'm going to be the first one to break it, because it's kind of boring and it lasts for a couple of minutes. And also, when you're doing a profile for a magazine, that just doesn't even apply, because all this news is happening over the top of you as you're talking to them. So you have to kind of liberate yourself from the kind of lobby instinct, or the sort of the news reporter instinct, to try and find a line. You're not trying to find a line. You're trying to understand them. So you have to sort of wrestle them away from the news agenda. And the reason that working at American newspapers or magazines is so has been so formative for me is that that's what they encourage. They want to drag you away from that instinct, and they also do profiles in a different way. I remember I was at Politico, and my editor and I were talking about David Davis, the Brexit secretary, and I was sat in his room in Brussels, and he and I was saying, "Oh, he's this kind of weird guy, right? He was brought up in poverty in York by, I think he was like his grandparents, and then he's like suing the British government in the European courts." And he was like, "What? I don't. That's not like the caricature that we know in Brussels." And I was like, "Yeah, he's kind of strange fish, right?" He said, "Right, I want a profile." I said, "Fine." And I went away and I did what I thought was like a decent profile. It was, I think, 1,200 words or something about David Davis. Spoke to him and maybe a few others around him. And I gave it to him and he was like, "No, no," spiked it and just said, "No, this isn't good enough. Like, I want you to go and hang out with him, go and play golf with him, like go to his house and have a barbecue." And I was like, "That does not happen in British journalism. What are you talking about?" And he gave me all these American pieces about profiles on people, and that's what they do there. And I was just really sort of reluctant. I said, "It's just not going to happen. It's not part of our culture." But eventually, they let me join them on this trip to Rome and then to Poland, and I followed David Davis around, and he took me out to dinner in Rome and just sort of got to know him. And that was the first time I'd done this kind of American style profile, and then I did it with Johnson. And the key is just constant um, time with them. So you've got to spend as much time with them as you can away from politics. At the end of a day is quite good, in places where they maybe they sort of free themselves up a bit. So for this one, I flew with him to this aircraft carrier that was off the coast of Cornwall. So I saw him on the plane, went up to him in the cockpit, and he sat there behind the two pilots in his like a special seat. Looks like a proud little boy, sort of looking out over England and the sort of the country that he governs. Very serious, earnest kind of guy. And then we arrive into this other like military base. Then we get on a helicopter and go to this aircraft carrier. Then we spend the day there. And then you just watch him interacting with people, just like scribble everything down that you notice. Like the time he sits there in this canteen with all these sailors, and he's just got this plate of plain baked beans in front of him. Like, so, you go up to the canteen, you've got sausages, bacon, eggs, all of it. And he's got a plate of plain baked beans. And for a while I thought, God, is that the metaphor of this like prime minister? Like the beans? Is that it? And I was like, why the hell has he got a plate of beans in front of him? And then I realized he's a pescatarian. So that's all he could have. That's all he could have. And he didn't want it. And it just was there, plonked in front of him, and I don't think he touched it. And then he was just chatting to people, and I just had this sense watching him and his interactions that he was like just this slightly awkward, not in a cringe way, not like, oh my god, he's not David Brent, but it's sort of just a little bit out of place. Not one of the lads, not quite comfortable,
Mm.
in that environment. So sort of you build on those things, and then you see him in different environments. I went with him to Oslo again, saw him very early in the morning on the plane, spoke to him on the plane, spoke to him at the end of the day in Oslo, and that's where he got really upset, which maybe we could talk about. But and then I saw him in number 10, and that was probably the most time when he was the most relaxed, and we had a beer in number 10, which I don't think he wanted, but he went and got one because he kind of promised that we were going to have this kind of relaxed beer. And that was the end of the day on a Wednesday, which is after Prime Minister's questions again. So he's kind of able to relax a bit. And then I followed him up to Glasgow. So over the time, the idea is you kind of build layer upon layer. And then if something strikes me as interesting in one interview or in one moment, then I'll press him on it in the next, and then the next, and then the next. And we keep going until he finally sort of tells me what he really thinks.
Yeah, very good. There's I think like pieces like this, they kind of sit in a tradition that maybe starts in the new journalism with like Frank Sinatra has a cold, and
That's
then
the one. That's the exact one. Sorry that my American editor gave me.
yeah,
You have to read this. I was like, David Davis is not Frank Sinatra.
it's not quite the same. And then and I think okay, what other profiles of British politicians really struck me, and I think of Sam Knight in the New Yorker doing Sadiq Khan, which obviously is an American magazine, and actually probably beyond your Johnson piece, which I do want to talk to you about, but we'll get there. There's not really a great deal of this type of journalism about our prime ministers. Okay, so across those meetings, other than the sort of mournful bean plate, what did you learn about him? What was it that struck you? What was something that across those meetings you thought, I'm going to pull on that thread? That's something I want to follow.
So it was essentially how he deals kind of with people personally and how he understands the job, which was a bit different from other prime ministers. So he spent the night on this aircraft carrier, which is unusual. A lot of prime ministers want to get back to number 10 quite quickly, but he wants to go out and meet people and stay in places. He likes to get away from number 10. And he talks quite openly about that and sort of says, I think if you meet people in their place of work, rather than them coming to you in number 10, he says it gives them more dignity, it gives them more power in a sense, because they're in their comfort zone, and they open up more about their life and what it is, the stresses of the work. So and then he says, well, you learn things then about the job. And I talk about this in the piece. He was struck by this time he went to see a returning submarine where they'd been underwater for a long time on duty, and when they're underwater, they cannot be told about major things that have happened in their lives. So they could be away for months, 6 months, and so they come back, and 4 people had been told that their partners have had a baby. So presumably they were aware that that was happening, and then but they're told it's happy, healthy boy, girl, whatever. And then he's struck by this person who uh, finds out he's lost both of his parents. Uh, and Starmer apparently can't shift this story from his mind. And he keeps coming back to it in conversations with me and then with his aides, like he raises it. And to him, this is like the importance of going and visiting places. So you learn stuff and then you understand it and then you can apply it and you keep those people in your mind's eye. He always says this, oh, you keep these people in your mind's eye when you're making decisions. And you could be cynical about that and think, oh, that's just what politicians would say, right? I think a sort of more interesting cynical take is that the job of a prime minister to sort of go around sort of meeting all of the people that kind of he employs, almost like the sort of he's the manager of the British state and these are his workers,
Mm.
and he goes and understands them. Well, like, do you not have to think at a kind of more strategic level and just be like, you just got to be driving that that state forward, turning it around or whatever. So I think that's something that played on my mind, that sort of idea of him as a manager, because that's what he did when he was director of public prosecutions. Went and met everybody, and because he thought that's what a good manager does. But then in his conversations with people, he focuses on the family and the personal life. So he would go round the room, and I had this sense, and I thought about Boris Johnson and what Boris Johnson would be like on an aircraft carrier with 1,000 sailors about to depart on a 8-month tour of the world, and you can tell that they're kind of desperate to talk about it because they're excited. They're going to Singapore, they're going to Japan, they're going to go out on the lash, right, in Singapore, and they can't bloody wait to get out. And you imagine Johnson just bowling into this like bar, the officers' mess, and just being like, "Yeah, go for it. You bet you can't wait. You're away from the wife for 8 months. Blah blah blah." It'll be full of jokes, guns, innuendo, all of it, and that would either go down well or not. But everywhere he went, his immediate thing was to joke, 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 and that was the challenge for him of getting under his skin. Just like stop the jokes for a second. What do you think? With Starmer, it's the opposite. They're kind of like, "Oh, we're gonna go. It's gonna be great." They're excited, and then his reaction is, "But what about the families? Must be very difficult for you because they serve too, don't they? They take a lot of pain as well." And you can see them kind of sort of deflate. The excitement deflates a bit, and they go, "Yes, sir. Yeah, yeah. It's very difficult, And we say this. We always say that the most difficult job is for the wives." And you're like, okay, you're into just seriousness
Yeah.
immediately. And so I wanted to ask him about that. And that's when we got into why is he drawn to that story? And why is he drawn to such kind of seriousness?
I've been on those boats as well, and I've been in the canteen, I've been in the officers' mess, and for want of a better word, I would just describe them as like hyper masculine environments.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of that sort of bravado, sort of piss taking banter, and when I read that in the piece, I was like, he's just reminded a sailor about how lonely his wife's going to be for 8 months whilst he goes on tour, and it's like that's not the kind of that's gonna go out there and smash it, have a great time, and I found that quite striking, and I was wondering, is that a sort of an inability to pick up on social cues or a lack of awareness of context? Is it just this kind of obsession that he has with dignity and service and duty? And so in these sailors, he recognizes that characteristic that is something he thinks is kind of one of the optimum human values that he wants to dial into and engage with, or he thinks there might be some common ground between them and being able to share sort of the burden of service when they could have a conversation about it. It really struck me as sort of a man who was, I don't want to say like out of his depth, because he's clearly not the Prime Minister, but was maybe slightly uncomfortable in the social surroundings. I don't know what your read was on what his motivation was for doing it. Was it that type of duty, service, dignity? That's what he was drilling into, and that's why he was talking about it.
Yeah. I think it's a way of building a connection. He kind of, or tries to build a connection. He's sort of saying, I understand, and I understand how much you're giving, for this, and all of these kind of quite conservative or old-fashioned values that he looks to, like service, duty, sacrifice, all of that. He talks in that language.
Yeah.
He understands it. He's drawn to that language. And when I remember thinking to myself, does he not see it in himself, right? So, you remember before the election, there was that sort of absurd story where everyone was calling him like Keir Shirker or something. I can't remember what it was, because he said he wants to keep his Friday nights free with these kids,
Yeah.
or to watch the telly or something.
Selfish.
Yeah. No, what do you think is going to be like an easy job? And it's kind of, it never worked, because nobody looks at Keir Starmer and goes, "Oh yeah, like lazy shirker." Like they think, if anything, like he works too much. I remember there was a good column about that. It's like Starmer's problem is he doesn't stop and read a book, or or I don't know, watch something sort of moving. This is a guy who does not go to the theater, right? It's frivolous.
Yeah.
So it just sort of didn't. Yeah, there is a kind of puritanism with him, and I sort of asked him, because you're away here overnight. You didn't need to be. You didn't need to be away from overnight in Downing Street, where your family are. And then I asked it. When I was in Oslo with him, He was it was Friday night. We were in Oslo. It was about 5:30. And from there, he was flying on to Poland, where he was catching an overnight train to Kiev. And this was, again, I sort of, do you not see that you said this about your Friday nights? You're away again on a overnight. You are the prime minister. Like that is a sacrifice for your family. Like you're aware of that. And then he says, essentially, then he starts to talk about it, and he talks about how he hadn't thought of that in that way. He doesn't think of it in this way. But yes, he sort of acknowledges it. But he's he'll stress, like I place a lot of emphasis on seeing my kids and protecting them and that kind of thing. And he makes sure he's home for when his son gets back from kickboxing on at a certain time, a certain day. And he takes his son to Arsenal, season ticket. He tries to carve out these moments. People who know him say he's like intensely normal outside of the job. In a way though that's like they will pore over like the football gossip column, who's signing who, whatever, and they'll watch old clips of Arsenal on YouTube. That's how. I mean, I see myself in that, right? I think a lot of people will see themselves in that. It's quite an interesting thing for a prime minister. That's how he relaxes. But once you get onto this territory, then I think you start to see the reasons why he's so focused on these things, and it's ultimately like a lot of prime ministers. A lot of it comes back to their own childhood and his own parents and his relationship with his dad, his relationship with his mum, his relationship with his sisters and brother, as well as the kind of person he's trying to be, which is not the kind of person that his dad was.
It's really striking. We'll talk about family next, but I'm a football fan, and I understand Starmer to be a genuine football fan, season ticket holder. As far as I'm aware, still plays, maybe not weekly, but as much as he can with his mates.
I wasn't allowed in. I wanted the part of this to be, why don't you let me play football with you?
Yeah.
I'll play football with you. I mean, I had these sort of visions of like I'm in hospital on a Friday night because the prime minister has like smashed me up against the wall. Or
The
something.
midfield enforcer, yeah.
Yeah, all that. And but anyway, he was like, no, that's
Sacred space, yeah.
Sacred space, yeah.
It's interesting, right? So, to all intents and purposes, he's a genuine football fan. But then I listen to him talking about football, and it's almost like the language and he doesn't have the same vocabulary as everyone else I know that talks about the game. And that's one example when he's on AFTV and he's talking about like the smell of horse manure and I think grilled onions reminding him of match day or freshly cut grass. And I mean, I don't think of horse manure. I don't think of freshly cut grass. I do think of the onions. It's like it doesn't quite jam right. And then there was a Guardian profile during the election which became quite famous because it was like, what do you dream about? I don't dream. I like your heather tie. I wouldn't say it was heather. It doesn't have a favorite novel. Doesn't have a favorite poem. And so you're looking at that going, okay, that doesn't strike me as normal. But so is he deflecting because he doesn't want to? High professional politician, totally controlled, totally on message, or is it like you were saying then? Oh, I don't know. I've never thought about it like that. Is that genuinely a statement of truth, and that he is just that is the way he sees the world? He doesn't think about those things either because he thinks they're frivolous or unnecessary. I don't know what your read on that is, and we'll talk about the family after.
On the football, I think it's genuine. So people would
Me too,
say,
yeah.
people would say like the problems with other prime ministers is that you to try and make them look like they care about football,
Yeah.
which is with Keir is like to try and stop talking about football.
Yeah.
He's got two mementos that I could see in his office. One was one photograph behind his desk of his family, and the other is a miniature World Cup that Arsene Wenger gave him that sits in there. I think it's genuine. Apparently he was obsessed as a kid, kicking the ball in the garden with his brother and all the way through school. And it was a rebellious thing at school, it seems, because he went to this grammar school where there was a push towards rugby and that kind of thing. And it was like a declaration of difference. He was a football boy. So I think it's genuine. In the conversations I've had, he seemed to know. I tried to get him on like, well, which player are you? Like, what's your character, your alter ego in football? And he wouldn't be drawn. Again, there's the control element, I suppose. But I was like, he was like, it would be a midfield enforcer,
Mm.
and I said, what, like Jordan Henderson, and he was like, oh, and he didn't want to go down to Jordan Henderson, and I thought, I don't know, there is a total control there, and also sacred space element of it.
Mm.
He suddenly sees panic, but on the thing about not sort of thinking about it, that is, I think, quite revealing. In that, I think most people in this country do not have a favorite poem that they just know off the top of their head, or a favorite novel,
Yeah.
in those kind of things. They might have a favorite movie, perhaps, or something, or a TV show or something. But so again, intensely normal. He's not a secret opera buff like
Yeah.
some, like Len McCloskey, or people like, wow, or these kind of things. He's A couple of things that struck me. They said he's like a lot. Somebody said this to me after I'd done the profile. Actually, they said he's like a barrister in that they move seamlessly from school to Oxford and then into the law, where every time that you kind of work hard and somebody pats you on the back and gives you a prize for doing something. Oh, you're so wonderful. You're so clever. And you keep getting these prizes and you keep rising in status. And that's the world he understands. And the world he doesn't understand is politics, where it's not work ethic. Look at these prime ministers we've had already: Gordon Brown, Theresa May, Rishi Sunak.
Yeah.
They work ridiculously hard and they're terrible at the job.
Mm.
It's a totally different skill, which he's got to somehow talk about how the vibe of the country, getting back to what I'm trying to do with the magazine. You've got to understand the vibe of the country, say what it is. Why are people rioting in Northern Ireland? Why were they rioting last summer? What is like lying at the heart of this? You don't just work harder to get through it.
Mm.
And the fact that he doesn't think about um, his own motivations for the way he behaves, what draws him to certain people. I genuinely think he doesn't sit there and think about it that much. He just thinks, get on with the job, Keir. And the fact that he doesn't sit and really reflect that much, I don't think, on the state of the country. I think they're kind of connected. He just thinks work.
Mm. You said something really interesting about his relationship with his father a couple of answers ago, and in the piece, as you're grappling with how to unlock him, someone sort of counsels you and said, if you want to understand him, ask him about his family and talk about your own. And you get this moment of a level of emotion and, I guess, the man that I haven't seen anywhere else in anything anything about him, whether it's a sort of television interview. I think I got a bit teary on Piers Morgan once. Now my memory's racing.
That's right, yeah.
But other than that, I haven't seen him in that kind of emotional state in the way that you describe it. Talk us through that. How did you get him to open up like that? How did you get him to reveal that side of his personality?
I was following him around Oslo for the day, and we'd gone again to another Navy ship, and I was just watching him doing the same thing, talking to the sailors in the same way, asking them about duty and sacrifice and all of that, again and again. And I was playing in my mind that conversation about, ask him about his family. That's what he cares about. And so I was like scribbling down things to think about. And I was thinking about his mom, his dad, both of whom have passed, and then his brother. And it was like his brother died on Boxing Day last year. And he was a vulnerable man, always had. He has this line where he says he didn't have learning difficulties, he had difficulties learning. And I don't quite know what that means, but it's clear that his brother, found life harder than Keir and was always going to find it difficult, and was vulnerable and didn't have any security in life. So by the sound of it, he sort of bounced around from job to job, didn't have security of tenure in his house, so slightly chaotic life, I think. Um, and Keir would help, where he could. And there are stories about him being best man at his brother's wedding, where he has to sort of, uh, in fact, sort of, I don't know if it's save the day, but he sort of impose some kind of order on proceedings. And I think he helped with money and that kind of thing. Anyway, he became ill cancer, then died. And I thought, I've got to just ask him about this. He hasn't opened up about that. And so I started with, reflections on why you're away. You're away on a Friday night. You said, you were keeping these sacrosanct. Do you think about that? And the sort of sacrifices your family are making. And that, so we started making inroads into his life. And then I was sort of asking about his parents. And as I said before, this relationship with his mum and dad, where his mum had something called Still's disease, which meant she was told she wasn't going to have any children. She couldn't have any children, but if she wanted them, she should try quickly. And she ended up having four quite quickly, of which Keir is the second, and then they have twins shortly after. One of whom is Nick, the brother who is more vulnerable. But the mother's illness meant she was sort of debilitated a lot of the time in a wheelchair. There's this memory that Starmer has of him coming back from school, I think, on a sort of country lane is how I picture it, and he sees his mother collapse onto the floor and not be able to get up, and then he has to go and run and pick her up. And that would stay in anybody's mind, I think. But so he understands the vulnerability completely. But his dad was essentially utterly devoted to the mum, and to the point where all emotion went entirely to the mum. Very little, it seems, to the kids. And he became, in time, it seems, this kind of reclusive, grumpy, distant, unemotional man, where it all goes to the mum. And Keir has this very difficult relationship where he wasn't able. I think that's where he was talking to Piers Morgan about that, and that they never had the chance to talk about it, or they and in fact, Starmer says to me, "I don't think we were ever able to. Like, even if he'd lived longer, I wasn't able to. He wasn't able to." Anyway, so that's the kind of background of the Keir story, and then he has this brother. So in a sense, Starmer is like a carer to his brother, and they share a bedroom. And that's, I think, a key part of the Starmer story. Starmer, the teenage carer of his brother in a family affected by this kind of trauma of serious illness, and this kind of strange emotionless father. So that's the background. And then I sort of start to ask him, and he tells me something about a speech. He tells me about the speech he gave to the Labour Party conference, and I remember that this is the one where he mentions his brother. And he has this moment. I remember thinking at the time, I thought, that's strange. He says, "My father always said to me, Keir, I'm just as proud of your brother, who's achieved just as much as you." And Keir said, "My dad was right," or something like that.
Mm.
I thought, "Oh, why has he said that there?" Oh, yeah, okay, slight odd tangent, but I didn't know, obviously, that his brother was dying at that point. And so I ask him. That's the point where I start to ask him, and that's the immediately where Starmer just is finds it very, very difficult. He immediately wells up. Tears are clear in his eyes. He's staring at me kind of intently, not like in a sort of angry way, but almost I sort of try and describe it in the piece as a bit distant, in that he's sort of looking through me, thinking, obviously, and he's just full of tears. Like they're not streaming or anything, but they're just right there. And he starts to talk about it, and he says, I tried to talk. I didn't want to talk about my brother because I didn't know how. I thought if I spoke about him, it would be disrespectful, be like using him as a prop. And I just and he starts to try and explain it, and the tears are there, and he's like, I can't explain it, something to those words. And I thought, God, again. He's like, he butts up against this thing where he's like, I can't explain it. I haven't thought about that. I didn't think about it like that. I didn't probe too deeply. I haven't thought. I can't explain. I can't explain that. And so I sort of eventually got this understanding of Starmer, that he's this sort of buttoned up, quite old fashioned man, 62. I point out in the profile, quite old for a prime minister. So he's quite an old fashioned, and the emotion is just there. It's just there. Like it takes nothing for it to come out. It's just immediate, and so that's a key part to him. And then it's the inability to articulate his emotion. And I think that's the connecting thread with his inability to articulate what he wants to do as prime minister, what this Labour government is for, what the country feels. Why is it so sort of on the edge? Why is the country so emotional? I think that sort of inability to articulate feelings is a core part of the Keir Starmer problem.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I found the piece to be so perceptive. There's the comedian Bill Burr has this bit where he talks about basically like failing to address his emotional trauma. He's like, I'll just take that and I'll just shove it in there with the rest of it and I'll just keep it bottled just there. And okay, so you think about Starmer within the Labour Party, 14 years of Tory rule. Okay, maybe someone who's a little bit more of an empath, a little bit more sympathetic, slightly more emotionally attuned. But actually, what you're kind of describing, particularly within men of his cohort, is a very typical problem who struggle to communicate their emotions, perhaps struggle to communicate full stop. And if we now zoom out big picture and we're talking about the state that the country is in, where we potentially have a traumatized prime minister that actually, and you go, okay, well, actually, I think the country's quite traumatized. So
Exactly.
there's some play between those two things, and if he is able to find his voice, and maybe this will be the sort of hero's journey he goes on, he can be the person to address.
Unlikely. I
Yeah,
think, yeah.
yeah, I would say so too. But
Yeah.
I think we have to hope for all of us
Yeah, positivity is good.
that he might do. Yeah, because like I've spoken about this a fair amount. I think it's a ginormous political mistake to contain the race rioting last year and go, right, that's boxed off, that's dealt with, it's over. You can look at Ballymena right now and what's happening and the potential that it's sort of spilling out into other places. Sectarian violence of any kind, whether it's what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in India. That there are so many of these various different flashpoints in the country, and I feel like the social fabric has been frayed and atrophied, and in some cases deliberately destroyed in such a way that really sort of the national political mood in the country, away from Westminster and the media discourse, which I think is kind of operating on a different plane that perhaps doesn't fully plug in to the way the rest of the country is feeling. And the Labour Party's hedge is that better management, you can fix these things, right?
Yeah.
Fiscal rules, or take your pick, to be completely reductive. It's like, well, we can just run the spreadsheets better and we'll be able to fix this mess.
Yeah. Which is what Rishi Sunak thought.
Yeah. Okay, that's the hedge. And if it doesn't work out, and I suspect it won't because of the context I've just described, then essentially the populist right, nationalist populist right, are sort of waiting to collect all the chips and march up Downing Street. Is that essentially the sort of the conundrum that Starmer faces?
Yeah.
He has to find his voice in that way.
Yeah, but it's more than a hedge in a way. It's a belief. So it's either because he doesn't examine the country enough in the way he doesn't examine his emotions. He doesn't go and see the country and how raw it is. Like, he goes to these naval bases and to military headquarters and to the headquarters of Jaguar Land Rover and to, I don't know, the headquarters of Aldi, when he meets people. But, this is a guy who I do think grew up in sort of lower middle class to sort of working class background. I don't think it's a lie, the sort of story that he's painted. But it was in Oxted in Surrey. It's intensely connected to London and grammar schools and sort of ladders of kind of prosperity in a way that, say, I don't know, places that are like Great Yarmouth, where wife's family are from. Like, it doesn't have those obvious ladders out. There's so many parts of the country which are just not like that. So but what are the places that made him? Oxted, Leeds, where he went to university, then Oxford, where he I think he did a law masters, and then London, and then he's in Islington for the rest of his time. These are real places. They're not like fraudulent parts of the country, but they're not Birmingham and Yarmouth and Blackpool and these places. So does he know that? Does he understand the country and Ballymena? What is going on? What is going on, and how kind of why it's so tense? I think that's a genuinely open question. And has he examined like the economic basis of the problems? Like 2008, is the economy that existed there, the political model that was founded on top of that, Blairism, and then Cameronism and all the rest. So just gone.
Mm.
Like it's just not that when the economy blew up, that was it. It was gone. And for the last however many years it is now, 17 years, we've just tried to get back to that. If we get back to that, Cameron by saying, well, if we get the Chinese to pour money into the city, then the city will still be the center of global finance. And actually, that just went, never coming back, and you have to find a new model. And this is the kind of 1970s analogy where you have this series of people trying to make the model work, and they have a similar thought to Starmer. Whether it's Heath or Wilson, Callaghan, they think the country's decent, sensible, moderate, not fundamentally broken. If you just fix it, the system can carry on. And maybe they were right, but it didn't work out like that way. Somebody else came, because when they lost control for enough time that the country voted for somebody who was just going to put it out of its misery, kill it off. And that's what obviously that's Thatcher 79. That's the kind of analogy now. Is he, and this is kind of what I try to pose, is he like the first normal prime minister who just looks like a Danish prime minister, right? Just sort of, yeah, he's fine with Britain not being like a great power. It's just normal. We're normal, have normal problems, normal country, like fine. And he's just a normal guy. And we'll just have a succession of normal people who are not in any sense Titanic figures. Like, who's the last Titanic prime minister? Probably Margaret Thatcher, the last prime minister of genuine kind of global influence on her own. And then all of the prime ministers that followed her have been less powerful in time. And then Blair, you might say, did he reach for sort of global significance? Maybe for a short time, but like ultimately the country wasn't as powerful as it was, and he screwed it up. So so the decline sort of sped up. This is an argument. And then all those prime ministers who tried to buck the trend, Johnson, Truss, explode, and so we're left with sort of spreadsheet men. First Sunak and then Starmer. That's like one argument. So he's the beginning of a new normal. Where we don't have a global financial center, we don't have anything of global significance. We're just a normal country. We're just going to make that work. Or is he the last of the kind of normal? He's the last one trying to make the old system work, and then you've got the people coming to kill it off. And they're right now, it's obvious, it's generic or it's Farage. And they're waiting, ready to say, I told you so. You can't fix the refugee problem without leaving the ECHR. You cannot fix the economy without doing something absolutely radical, burning down the OBR or something, or whatever, smashing up the Treasury. You can't do any of this stuff because you're so wedded to this broken system. And, it's mass deportations, it's borders, it's whatever it is, And I think that's the kind of the hedge, if you like, of the fundamental question that hangs over this government. He's either right and he'll slowly kind of tweak it into an acceptable position of normality, or he's wrong and we're getting somebody who's going to blow it up.
It's high stakes. Tom McTague, thank you so much for making the time for us. I really appreciate it. I can't wait to read the rest of the magazine, and best of luck in the new gig. Thank you
very much. Thanks for having me.